Join me, Harriet Gould, for the Lab Matters podcast to hear fascinating stories every week from the inspiring people behind the science. In this episode of Lab Matters with me, Harriet Gould, find out from Marc Reid why you are not a fraud. Today we have with us Marc Reid. Marc is a scientist and author. Marc, thanks so much for joining us today.
Pleasure, thank you.
You did your PhD, your master's and your PhD in chemistry, and you've written a book called You Are Not a Fraud, which goes into the psychology of why we feel like imposters, and is perhaps what led you to audaciously compile a list of failures on your own website, a concept which, well, if you ask me, seems a little bit counterintuitive, even to people who know they get as much information from failures as they do from successes. Looking at your CV and your list of accolades, I don't really know where to start, to be honest. So I think maybe let's go back to the beginning, as it were, and we can get a sense of the evolution for this inspiration.
Okay. Where to
Back to the
start?
beginning.
Well,
Back to the
I'll do
beginning.
it. I'll do it semi-Star Wars style, since you mentioned the CV of failures and its audacity, counterintuitiveness, and many other things besides. So that in detail is a small part of my website that I continue to update as of 2024. That is essentially a curation of all the jobs I didn't get, all the grants I never won, all the rejections that have come my way, all the interviews I didn't get, and so on and so forth. So all the stuff, in other words, that would never make it onto your normal CV is between the lines of a normal CV and would normally horrify people to describe out loud to those they are trying to impress with their CV. That's the best way I can put it. And you're right in that it was catalyzed for me by writing my book. I can come back to the full reasons for that later. But it wasn't my idea. I found the idea from some academics who had started to popularise it about a decade ago. So I'd seen fleeting examples of it, but I thought the concept, the exercise really deserved more airtime than it was getting. It had certainly been picked up by the media at the time, but still, and you've sort of picked up on this already, Harriet, whereby it's known, but it's not often used. So there's still an intimidation behind the exercise, as useful as it could be, that is making most people never ever touch it, even if they know about it. So going further back to the genuine beginning, to have been able to compile such a list of failures, let alone any successes, as you've said, I started by training in my PhD in one place. I don't think you said where it was, but my accent sort of gives away where I'm from. So I was born and raised in Glasgow. I'm at and was at the University of Strathclyde for my training. The sort of long story short from the professional side is I've been a glorified yo-yo in and out of my alma mater for most of my career. I have one thread that has, from my boyhood in Glasgow, been fueled by a genuine curiosity. I want to be a scientist. I was always like that. I was always poking at things, being annoying with why questions for my mum and dad.
Was that
And it never, sorry?
Did they encourage that, or did you have to fight back?
Yeah, I mean, it was never discouraged. The curious thing that links it to things we can discuss with the imposter syndrome and so on later on is that, I am one of many people for whom, detailed academic study, going to university was not the norm. There's a few members of the family more broadly who had been to university, or specifically my granddad, who didn't have the chance to do so until much later in his life. I wouldn't count myself as a second, third, fourth generation academic. Very much felt for me at the time that going towards that direction of travel wasn't really precedented. And so from those earlier days where, it was me maybe asking questions in school or, bringing some of that work home. It was almost like the immediate label of the clever one went on me. It sounds like the modesty hat's coming off, but that I'm far from the only one that gets that. And you get the jokes of, did we pick up the wrong baby at the hospital and stuff like that? It was just utterly endearing phrase in a roundabout way, but all at the same time signaling like this is different from what's been the trend in generations gone by. And I speak now at a more general level. I found this out. I found out how general this was in reading a book like Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers, where you see that your place in time really, really matters. And being part of more or less the millennial generation, I'm around at a time where it's more likely than not that my parents and grandparents worked in more labour intensive jobs. And I'm around at a time where it's more likely than not that I can have more academic pursuits than maybe they had the opportunity to do.
Mhm.
So I've gradually increased my awareness of these things whilst remembering those sort of very pleasant and complimentary jibes from my youth, that it was different. And therefore, every step that I've taken towards academia has at the same time had this echo of, this isn't really your path, big man. You should be doing something different. Now, this
Mhm.
isn't the norm for people like you. And that was probably the first whispers of stuff that got a lot more intense and sort of career threatening without sounding too dramatic much
Mm.
later on. If that makes sense.
How old were you when you started really piecing those thoughts together?
The thoughts on wanting to do
This
a
isn't the
career
right
in
path.
science, or oh no, those the seedlings of doubt.
Yeah.
Um, huh. I was always I was always one highlighted as being academically inclined throughout like primary school and high school. Um, so at that point, it didn't really bother me too much. In fact, all the way up to my PhD, I was always driving as hard as I could. I was always that way inclined. I was always supported to be that way. The point where it really triggered something deeper and far more negative was when I made my first big professional move, if you like. And that was after my PhD towards my first postdoc. So I was very much pursuing this part of my life was pursuing a very traditional linear academic path. Do the degree, do the PhD, do the postdoc, maybe do another 2 or 3 postdocs, depending on how things go, then try to gun for the independent academic positions. So at that step up the ladder or attempt to do so, going from PhD to postdoc, in more general terms, that landed for me like my very first move to another team, another job, another institution, with a hell of a lot of unknowns. And I didn't really know terms to do with self-doubt or imposter syndrome back then. However, where that earlier self-awareness grew was in observing my behaviours that were different in my postdoc from day one versus what I'd become very used to in my PhD for 3 years previous. And by that, I mean, I got very good very quickly at Google stalking all of my new colleagues. I was really good at coming up with excuses as to why they were cleverer than me or more deserving than me to be in that job. And that's when it started the more, I guess, more stereotypical feeling with regards to the so-called imposter syndrome, where you think the boss is going to come in any day now and say, we've found you out. Here's your ripped up contract, go back to where you came from, and that sort of stuff. So it was
Mhm.
that first big move, if you like, was my real trigger point. And then it was just day after day, it was stuff like that I noticed me doing until it got to the point where I noticed there's a higher percentage of my day spent worrying about this stuff than actually enjoying my time being in this new lab. Right.
Mhm.
And when I talk about this more publicly, I say the following, and I really mean this without exaggeration. Right. At that time in my life, I was moving to work in the single scientific laboratory in the world that I wanted to work for. Right. If I had a wish list and sent it to Santa of the scientists, my wish was granted, right? I didn't need anything further down that list as a
Mhm.
as a booby prize. I was where I wanted to be to learn what I wanted to know next to progress that academic career, right? So there was bits of it that were amazing, and I felt it being compromised by all of this new behaviour that had been triggered by the move, and that's what then led to me looking back on it quite stubbornly and secretly writing to myself. So anything that, we might talk about book-wise later on, none of it was ever meant to be a book. Back then, I say stubborn because I was the sort of person that wouldn't really talk to anybody about this sort of stuff. Internalized to the nth degree. And the only way I got it out is, I think serendipitously at the time, I'd started to sort of find out a little bit more about entrepreneurship, having come from a more academic training. So I'd started listening to podcasts and a lot of business people talking very openly about, mind management tools that they were using, one of which happened to be journaling.
Mhm.
So because I was listening to that stuff, the idea probably occurred to me that these things are happening to me in the lab. They are getting to the point where they're seriously threatening my ability to enjoy myself and progress while I'm here. I need some way to get this jumble of stuff out of my head, out on paper in front of me. So the laptop got cracked open. I went home every day during that postdoc, and it might have been a word, it might have been a paragraph, it could have been 3 pages, but every day I wrote some variation of what I'd noticed in my behaviour that day.
Mm.
Slowly but surely that turned into then me not just writing about almost like me as a fly in the wall observing myself, but it evolved into things like, I might have found a book or an article or a podcast or a quote, the sorts of things that started to become tools in the bag, the things that could start to help me, things that I noticed that if I used them were helping me do the stuff that I was actually there to do and enjoy doing, rather than procrastinating and worrying and wallowing in all the self-doubt that had come before.
Mhm.
Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense, but it's surprising and not surprising getting to know you a bit how evolved I think you are, and that sort of degree of self-awareness that you actually had and the wherewithal to actually make something productive happen. Even if you didn't know it was going to solve the problem, you were still doing something in a productive way rather than letting it eat away at you, which I think is what perhaps might set you apart from some other people in the same situation.
Mm, okay, that's firstly very kind to hear. I appreciate that a lot. And balance though, and I do this as I do with my own students, is that there's always bits of these stories that you don't see, and then otherwise we assume that it's some sort of divinely inspired skill.
Mhm.
Um, However, I raise this point of balance because there've been other bits of my life where I've had to behave in the same way and almost treat it like self-engineered therapy. Again, probably because I'm not the sort of person who finds it easy to make that step to say, I will go to see a therapist. I will talk to my wife or my friends or my family about these things. And although it's maybe a story for another time, like, we're talking about career paths and self-doubt and imposter syndrome, and that has led to that level of self-engineering of therapy, if you like, through the book. But in a completely parallel bit of my career, I was once upon a time quite obsessed with safety and did a lot of work there. And long story short, that was, both academically and for the sake of public writing, that was to do with my dad having been involved in a major accident in the 1980s. He struggled mentally with that, ended up dying prematurely for various complications with alcoholism. I had no idea how to process that until I'd turned at least 30. And the
Mm.
only way I started to process it was to make it a very public journey. I wrote about what I remembered seeing growing up. I learned more about the history of the accident itself, turned it into a bit of scientific work that I did in my own lab as an academic. And all of it could very much be framed as, the hero's journey, and someone who's very academically gifted. But in balance, that's just another example of what I see for myself as I'm too stubborn and perhaps have too much bravado to do these things privately. And it's working through science and work like that is actually how I manage myself from a therapeutic standpoint.
Sounds quite practical, if you ask me.
It is, but I guess there's the way to close that bit off is to think I do it because I can.
Mm.
I also do it because I have to. There's parts of it that I wish I wasn't motivated to do.
Mhm.
There's it's just that's the cards that I've been dealt.
And it sounds to me like you're making the very best of them. Um, so after you'd started writing the diary,
Yeah,
if we can call it the diary,
yeah,
um, did did that help immediately? Did you instantly start noticing an improvement in how you were enjoying the job and the place that you were at, and you stopped obsessing over why everyone might be better than you? How long did that process take, and what made it go from okay, I'm out of control here, I'm gotta talk about it
yeah,
on paper to okay, I'm in in the driving seat again. We
yes.
can move forward with confidence.
It was pretty quick. The way it was quick was because it helped compartmentalize the process a little bit more, I think, whereby, I gave almost a scheduled time and place to reflect on these things. And when I got into the habit and knew that that scheduled time was coming, it then meant perhaps subconsciously that I was more comfortable focusing on the science and the day job stuff, more so because I knew that I was going to give time for these reflections later. So it was pretty quick in terms of, establishing the habit and feeling my shoulders dip a bit with the relief of being able to work in that way. At the same time, overall, that was a process that I did for 2 years straight. That position that I was in, the postdoc position I was in, was in exactly 2 years. And I did it for most of the days that I was there for those 2 years.
Mm.
So it was a very quick impact, but one that required consistency for maintained impact, if you see what I
Mm.
mean.
Hmm. Do you think any of your colleagues had an inkling of how you're feeling?
I've actually, it's funny you mention that. It's only since making it super public, we're talking 5+ years later, when I started writing the book and talking about it and putting stuff out online, that any of them saw it for the first time. They said we back then working together, and these are folks that have gone off in several different career directions. Some are academics like me, some are in publishing, some are out in industry. None of them had any idea.
Mm.
Right. And that was, to me, unsurprising, surprising to them to hear this out loud, but it was unsurprising to me because I was doing my best at the time to hide it. Right. So I
You
was
did a good
very
job.
much wearing that mask, and I was like, okay, good. That version of myself would have been happy that they didn't know, because that
Mm.
was my intention at the time.
Mm.
Um, but fast forward many moons later, when I actually started, getting away from the diary side of stuff and got the seed planted to write for a book and do a bit more research, then is when I found out how far from alone I was in being someone who would keep it to themselves or felt alone in the process of having such intense self doubt.
Mm.
That was both horrifying and reassuring when it came to pass.
Lab Matters is brought to you by the award-winning temperature control equipment from Polyscience, available worldwide. Polyscience, changing the world of temperature control forever. And when I hesitate because I wondered whether to say it. And I mean, I've experienced similar things, so I can identify with
Okay.
it. The intensity of self-doubt when it comes to you is quite overpowering. And I find that I do talk about it to people who tend not to believe me,
Yes.
which is another angle.
Well,
Um,
see, well, you say that, Harriet. It's a very important point, actually, because there's a lot of discussion of the imposter syndrome, as most people call it, where that point that you've just made is the center of a lot of misinterpretation. a lot of people, in other words, will say imposter syndrome and think it's synonymous with low self-esteem, full stop. But it's actually that surprise that other people find when they hear about it from you or me that is central to the definition of the whole thing. To put that a third way, it always happens with people who have ambition or drive, or outwardly they are successful in other ways. There's hard evidence that they actually deserve to be where they are, despite what they're feeling internally. So it's no wonder that there's surprise on the other side when people hear it, because without that surprise, then you're not really talking to someone who outwardly signals a lot of ambition and drive. Right? The imposter syndrome is a very intimately intertwined dance between someone who has self-doubt, but self-doubt brought along by the fact that they are striving for something in particular. So it's
Indeed.
both of those things together.
Mm. Um, so now you said you did a lot more research
Mhm.
before writing the book. Was presumably that was in a lot of psychology and
Yeah.
other areas of
Yes.
psychoanalysis.
Yeah. Very, very deep down rabbit holes, or driving in lanes that are not normally mine academically, and that a lot of people ask about that. Maybe I'll come back to it. It's like, why? I actually remember talking to someone once who read a list to me of my degrees and then said, none of these are in psychology. Why are you doing anything book-wise to do with psychology? That's not your major.
Mhm.
So I'll come back to that. But to answer your question, there was a lot of research I did before I started writing the book, and then a hell of a lot more during the writing. Now, before I started writing properly, I did start to try to get out there and do more public outreach lectures and career-focused events. And what those were, from my selfish perspective, was an excuse to put together a slide deck in a medium where I have to tell a good story in order to hold someone's attention.
Good
So
skill.
therefore, it was a medium where I could look and, to the flesh and the blood and the eyes of the audience in front of me and say, figure out, is what I'm saying right now holding someone's attention? Is this something that one day would be worth transcribing into the written form for a paragraph or a book chapter? So I started experimenting with that much earlier than I did the hardcore research for the book, which came later. So I've put stuff out on, YouTube from before and during the pandemic days, for example. And, if you look at those are all me experimenting with potential content for the book that came later. And so I was taking signals of what questions people were asking me, what parts held attention, what bit got reactions, and trying to curate that for the stuff that I would write later. Now, the hardcore psychology stuff, diving more into the academic side of things, that simply took more time. As with any research, I was trying to find journals and articles, in bits of academic space that I wasn't used to playing in, given the fact that I'm a chemist by background. But also, and quite fortunately, in order to test my own thoughts on how I would turn this diary into research that I could lead, I have one friend in particular, a couple of friends now who are psychologists, and who I could essentially get first-hand peer review from. Here's questions that I would want to survey people with. Are they the sorts of questions that are fitting for a psychological survey? Are they open enough? Are they leading? And get someone's scrutiny on it before I ever tried to do anything. Bring a bit of scientific rigor to it, all the while not pretending that I could somehow endow myself as an expert in psychology.
What were some of those questions? Do you remember?
Some of them, so there was a part of the survey that I put out for the book that started with um, a well-known scale-based survey of statements that people have to say how much they agree or disagree with. So on a scale of 1 to 5, you might find statements like, if I'm going for a promotion or prize, I don't tell others until it's an accomplished fact.
Interesting.
Right? So how much do you agree with a statement like that? I remember my failings more than my successes. How much do you agree with that? So that's not what you're asking about, but that was an established scale, if you like, by one of the first people who studied the imposter phenomenon, as it's more technically called. That was Pauline Rose Clance. So that first part of the survey I did was very much inspired by her work. The second part, the bit that really demanded more thoughts on questions, and this was really the joy of it, right? Like as you're going along with these projects that don't feel like they're in your wheelhouse, you learn a lot more than you bargain for. So like, before we started recording, we were talking a little bit about podcasting, and you mentioned your feelings of becoming a better interviewer through the process of doing this. And I think it's a very similar feeling that I had when I was thinking about what questions to ask, because long after this has now been said and done, that awareness of how to ask questions has served me far beyond the concept of ever writing this book, because you learn to ask questions in a genuinely open way that's not leading someone to a yes or no answer. So it's not a closed question, but it's also not leading them to a particular style of answer. So there was a part of the survey where I had to get a question right. I can't remember the exact wording, but it was all ultimately leading to someone openly sharing their story of what the imposter experience meant to them. So was it, as we've discussed already, that was to leave it open for someone who was triggered by the fact that they were the first in their family to ever go to uni. Equally, it was open enough for someone who felt the pressure of parents or was triggered by moving from being, the top of their class at school to in the shark tank of very clever people at university. It was open to all of those stories, and that level of openness was necessary to lead to versions of analysis that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. So, for example, that ability to allow people to write freely and not lead them to an answer later led us to be able to pick out a top 10 list of phrases that kept coming up again and again when people diarised their own imposter experiences. And that's something I now use when I'm doing workshops on it, because you can then show people that this umbrella term that we use, imposter syndrome, has commonalities amongst everyone, but at the same time, you should treat everyone as an individual, because their particular story on leading themselves to think that they're a fraud is as unique as a fingerprint. And then that becomes a good exercise for leaders, because you then don't generalize people that are sitting in front of you.
Indeed. Oh, Mark, I feel like I could talk to you about this forever, and we haven't got forever, so we better not.
You're more
I don't know where to
disciplined than
go.
I am.
I don't know where to go from here. I think we should. When did the book come out?
It was first published in August 2022, so coming up for its second anniversary now.
So we can just, type it into Google and somewhere to buy it will come up.
Yes, I do this in various joking ways, but if you Googled Marc Reid not a fraud to convince yourself of that fact, you'll find the book.
Okay.
I did it in all mod cons, ebook, paperback, hardback, and eventually audio, which was an adventure in and of itself.
Yeah. How long did it take to record?
The audio part I thought would take 3 days. It took 3 weeks.
Okay.
I didn't realise just how exhausting sitting on your bum talking into a microphone for 2 hours a day could be.
Yeah.
And how many mistakes and bloopers would come up along the way.
Yeah.
Another part of this overall learning experience, something I wasn't ever planning, but some of that has stuck with me far beyond audiobook recording.
Exactly. You've gone into such great detail, and I feel like we've probably skipped over thousands of things, and that's just the way. Maybe you'll have to come back another time, and we'll talk about something else. But before we finish, I will stick a question in that will
Okay.
probably put you on the spot because I haven't warned you. Um, what's and you can keep it into the field that we've touched on.
Okay.
The question would normally be what are your hopes for the future of science, or if there was one thing you could change, what would it be? So that we do it in the context of what we've been talking about. What are your hopes for the future of people experiencing imposter syndrome, or the research in psychology, or what something along those lines?
I'm glad you didn't warn me. That's a great question. I answer it in the same way that I eventually thought about in order to write better than I originally did. And that was to think about writing as if sitting across the table from one other person. So answering your question as if it's that one person who needs to hear the things contrary to what they're feeling as loneliness. My genuine hope is that with a raised awareness or the tools to manage these so-called imposter experiences, that more and more people earlier and earlier in their working life will learn to become risk aggressive and not risk averse, to take the chance while you've got it, and all the while mitigate the risk of painful what if regrets when you're in your 70s and 80s.
Mm.
You'll always enjoy the stuff that you tried and failed more than the what ifs of stuff that you're too scared to try.
Very good. I like that a lot. Risk aggressive instead of risk averse.
Indeed.
Brilliant. Mark, thank you so much. It has been
Thank you.
more than insightful. I really, really appreciate it. And I hope you'll come back
Likewise,
again.
don't take these opportunities lightly. And I'm not that old yet, but the older I get, the more I think I'm just happy to be anywhere. So for you to have paid any interest in what I do, I deeply appreciate it. Thank you, Harriet.
It's a pleasure.